The email from the real estate attorney arrived just as my sister was sending me pictures of how she'd upgraded my childhood bedroom, replacing my achievement wall with her vision board and my custom bookshelves with her makeup vanity. She had no idea that I'd purchased our family home 3 days earlier, and that while she was redecorating my old room, I was reviewing the deed with my name on it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The notification chimed on my laptop as I was finalizing quarterly projections for the executive board meeting. I typically ignored personal emails during work hours, but the subject line from Wilson & Associates law firm, completed, Harper family home purchase, demanded immediate attention. I glanced at my office door to ensure it was closed before opening the message. The email was brief but definitive. The purchase had been completed, all paperwork finalized, and the property at 1428 Oak Ridge Lane was now legally mine. Attached were digital copies of the deed, transfer documents, and closing statements, official confirmation that my childhood home now belonged to me, not my parents. 3 days. It had been only 3 days since I'd signed the final papers, and already the situation had evolved in ways I hadn't anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text message from my younger sister, Megan. Without even opening it, I knew what it would contain. Another update about how she was improving my old bedroom now that I had abandoned it by moving to my downtown apartment. When I finally checked the message, my suspicions were confirmed. "Look how much brighter your old room is without all those boring bookshelves." The attached photo showed my carefully designed reading corner, the custom shelves that Grandpa Walter had helped me build when I was 14, completely gone. In their place stood Megan's mirrored vanity, covered with expensive makeup products our parents had likely financed. A second message followed immediately. "Mom said since you're never coming back, I might as well make good use of the space. Best room in the house now belongs to the right daughter." I placed my phone face down on the desk and took a deep breath. At 32, I was well past the age where sibling rivalry should affect me. As Chief Financial Officer for Meridian Healthcare Systems, I managed a 9-figure budget and led a team of 30 financial analysts. I made decisions daily that affected thousands of employees. Yet somehow, my 26-year-old sister still knew exactly how to get under my skin with just a few carefully chosen words. The irony of her timing was almost poetic. She had no idea that while she was redecorating her new room, I was reviewing ownership documents for the entire house. The decision to purchase my parents' home hadn't been impulsive, though I'd kept it completely private. When Dad called 2 months ago to tell me they were considering selling, his voice had carried the weight of reluctance that he tried to mask with practical reasoning. "The property taxes keep increasing and the maintenance is becoming too much," he'd explained. "We're thinking it might be time to downsize, maybe look at those retirement communities near Lake Westfield." What he didn't say, what he would never explicitly acknowledge, was that they were selling because they had depleted their retirement savings helping Megan through her series of fresh starts. The pattern had become predictable over the years. Megan would discover a new passion, convince our parents to invest in her venture, then abandon it when the initial excitement faded or when actual effort was required. There had been the boutique, clothing store that closed after 8 months, the yoga instructor certification she never used, the food truck she decided was too much work after 3 weeks, and most recently, the interior design business that existed primarily on Instagram, rather than in reality. Each failure came with financial consequences that my parents quietly absorbed. I'd calculated once that they had invested over $300,000 in Megan's various enterprises over the past 6 years. When I gently suggested that perhaps they should consider these investments more carefully, Mom had defensively responded, "She's just finding her way. Not everyone knows exactly what they want at 18 like you did, Caroline." It was true that I'd always been focused. While Megan was the social butterfly with an ever-changing array of interests, I had been steadfast in my pursuit of financial independence. I'd worked through college, secured scholarships, completed my MBA debt-free, and climbed the corporate ladder through strategic moves and consistent performance. By 30, I had established myself in a C-suite position that people a decade older were still aspiring to reach. My success had come with sacrifices, primarily in my personal life. While Megan documented her glamorous lifestyle on social media, I worked 60-hour weeks building financial security. She had the vibrant social circle. I had a 401k that financial advisors described as exceptional. She collected experiences. I collected assets. Our different approaches to life had been a point of tension since childhood. Mom always described us as the grasshopper and the ant, referring to the fable about preparation versus living in the moment. What bothered me wasn't the characterization itself, but the subtle implication that my choice to prioritize security somehow made my life less joyful or authentic than Megan's. The reality was more complex. I found genuine satisfaction in achievement, in creating stability, in the knowledge that I could weather whatever storms might come. My approach wasn't about denying pleasure, but about building a foundation that would support a lifetime of choices rather than momentary whims. When Dad mentioned selling the house, I recognized it as the consequence of choices made over many years. Not just their indulgence of Megan, but also their own financial decisions. They had prioritized immediate wants over long-term planning, emotional comfort over fiscal responsibility. I didn't judge them for it, but I wouldn't stand by while the home that held our family history was sold to strangers because of those choices. The solution had seemed clear. I would purchase the house myself. I had the financial means, thanks to years of disciplined saving and strategic investments. What I hadn't immediately determined was how to handle the complicated family dynamics that would inevitably follow. My initial thought was transparency. Simply tell my parents that I wanted to buy the house to keep it in the family. But after discussing the situation with my financial advisor, I recognized that this approach might create unintended complications. If my parents knew I was the buyer, they might insist on selling below market value, which would deprive them of funds they genuinely needed. They might feel embarrassed about their financial situation being so nakedly acknowledged. And most significantly, they might feel obligated to continue living in the house rather than downsizing to something that better suited their current needs. After careful consideration, I decided on a different approach. I would purchase the house through Evergreen Holdings, an LLC I had established for investment properties. The purchase would be at full market value, providing my parents with the financial resources they needed. Once the transaction was complete, I would reveal my ownership and discuss future arrangements, including the possibility of them continuing to live there under favorable terms if they wished, or proceeding with their downsizing plans and using the house as a family gathering place. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly Megan would insert herself into the situation. When our parents mentioned they were selling, she had immediately claimed rights to her fair share of the proceeds, despite having contributed nothing to the property's mortgage, maintenance, or improvement over the years. When that position gained no traction, she shifted strategies, moving back home temporarily, and gradually expanding her territory to include my former bedroom. That territorial expansion wasn't just about physical space, but about narrative, control. By erasing the traces of my presence in the house, she was reinforcing the story she preferred, that I had abandoned our family home because I was too focused on my career to care about sentimental attachments. That she was the daughter who remained connected to home and family while I chose corporate success over personal ties. It was a narrative that conveniently ignored her frequent financial dependence on our parents, her pattern of returning home. Whenever her latest venture collapsed, and the fact that my abandonment included paying for a new roof last year when a storm damaged the house and my parents' insurance didn't cover the full replacement cost. Now, looking at the email confirming my ownership and the text messages from Megan, I faced a decision point. I could immediately reveal that I had purchased the house, asserting my authority as the new owner. That approach would certainly provide immediate satisfaction, particularly in response to Megan's smug messages about claiming the best room. But it would also potentially damage family relationships and create a dynamic where my ownership became a weapon rather than a means of preservation. Alternatively, I could maintain the current arrangement temporarily, allowing my parents to announce their planned move to the retirement community, letting Megan believe she would need to find her own housing arrangement, and then revealing my ownership as a solution rather than a confrontation. This approach would require patience and restraint, especially in the face of Megan's continued provocations, but it might ultimately lead to a more constructive outcome. As I contemplated these options, my assistant knocked gently on my office. Ms. Harper, the executive board is assembling in the conference room. They're ready for your quarterly projections presentation. Thank you, David. I'll be right there. I closed the email, gathered my presentation materials, and took a moment to center myself. The house situation would require careful navigation, but right now, my professional responsibilities demanded full attention. Walking toward the conference room, I realized that this pattern, compartmentalizing personal challenges to maintain professional focus, had become second nature over the years. Some might view it as evidence of emotional detachment, but I understood it as a necessary skill. The ability to maintain perspective and performance despite personal turbulence had served me well, both in building my career and in managing the complex dynamics within my family. The board meeting proceeded smoothly, with my projections receiving unanimous approval. As Chief Financial Officer, I had developed a reputation for accuracy and strategic foresight that had earned the confidence of even the most skeptical board members. Today's presentation continued that track record, with my proposed allocation of resources for the upcoming expansion into telehealth services generating particular enthusiasm. Throughout the 2-hour meeting, the situation with the house remained in the background of my awareness. Not forgotten, but temporarily contained while I focused on immediate professional responsibilities. This compartmentalization wasn't about denial, but about appropriate prioritization. There would be time to address family matters after ensuring that my work obligations were thoroughly fulfilled. When the meeting concluded with congratulations and expressions of confidence in my financial leadership, I returned to my office to find 3 additional messages from Megan. The first showed her applying peel-and-stick wallpaper over the soft blue paint I had chosen for the room years ago. The second was a close-up of my achievement wall, certificates, awards, and recognition from throughout my academic and early professional career, now stacked in a storage container. The third was a selfie of her lounging on a new daybed where my desk had once stood, with the caption, "Manifestation Corner complete, ready to attract abundance. Blessed, living my best life." The irony of her speaking about attracting abundance while systematically removing evidence of the actual work required to achieve success wasn't lost on me. It perfectly encapsulated our different approaches to life. Megan believed in vision boards and manifestation. I believed in strategic planning and persistent effort. She focused on projecting an image of success. I focused on building its foundations. What bothered me wasn't that she'd taken over the room. I had indeed moved out years ago and had my own home now. It was the deliberate erasure of my history. There, the implicit dismissal of everything I had worked for as somehow less authentic or meaningful than her approach to life. And beneath that, it was the continuation of a family dynamic where her immediate desires consistently took precedence over longer-term considerations. As I was considering how to respond, or whether to respond at all, my phone rang. It was my father. "Caroline, do you have a minute to talk?" His voice carried that particular blend of hesitation and determination that I recognized from difficult conversations throughout my childhood, when he needed to discuss something important but wasn't entirely comfortable doing so. "Of course, Dad. Is everything okay?" He sighed softly. "Yes and no. The house sale is moving forward. We've accepted an offer." My heart skipped momentarily before I remembered that I was, in fact, the buyer he was referring to. The offer he had accepted had come from Evergreen Holdings, from me. That's good news, right? Isn't that what you and Mom wanted? It is. Yes. The offer is very fair, and the buyers have agreed to a flexible timeline for us to move out. We've been looking at that retirement community by Lake Westfield, and there's a 2-bedroom unit available that would be perfect for us. The relief in his voice was palpable. After years of financial stress, much of it related to supporting Megan's various ventures, they would finally have the resources to create a more sustainable situation for themselves. The knowledge that I had helped make this possible, even if they didn't yet know it was me, brought a sense of quiet satisfaction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm glad to hear that, Dad. It sounds like a good solution for you and Mom. It is, he agreed, before his tone shifted slightly. But there's something else we need to discuss. It's about Megan. Of course it was. I waited, knowing what was coming. She's upset about the move. She had assumed she could continue living in the house, and she's not taking the news well that she'll need to find her own place. I bit back the immediate response that came to mind, that perhaps at 26, it was indeed time for Megan to establish her own household rather than continuing to rely on our parents. Instead, I asked neutrally, what did she expect would happen when you sold the house? Dad's hesitation spoke volumes. I think she hadn't really thought it through. You know how she is, focused on the present moment. She's been talking about her design business taking off soon, and I think she just assumed everything would work out somehow. The somehow had always been the operative word in Megan's life planning. Things would work out somehow, which inevitably translated to, someone else will handle the practical details while I focus on more interesting aspects. I understand that's difficult for her, I said carefully. But isn't this an opportunity for her to take the next step in her independence? You and Mom have always supported her ventures. Maybe this is the push she needs to make one of them successful. Dad's sigh carried the weight of years of similar conversations. That's partly why I'm calling, Caroline. Your mother and I were wondering, with your new promotion and that big bonus you mentioned last month, would you consider helping Megan with first and last month's rent on an apartment, just to get her started? She's really determined to make the design business work this time, and she needs a little runway. And there it was, the familiar pattern reasserting itself. Megan's choices creating a situation, my parents absorbing some of the consequences, and then turning to me to provide additional resources without addressing the underlying pattern. The runway they mentioned had been extended countless times already, with no sustainable flight ever achieved. I thought about the documents in my email, about the house that was now legally mine, about the different ways this conversation might unfold if they knew the truth. Dad, before I answer that, can we talk about something else? Something important about the house situation that you should know. The moment had arrived sooner than I'd planned, but perhaps it was necessary. As I prepared to reveal my ownership of our family home, I wondered how this disclosure would reshape not just our living arrangements, but the deeper patterns that had defined our family dynamics for decades. Of course, sweetheart. What is it? My father's voice carried genuine concern, and I was reminded that despite the frustrations and complications, there was real love at the foundation of our family relationships. It's about the buyer of the house, I began, choosing my words carefully. The offer didn't come from a stranger. Evergreen Holdings is actually my company. I established it for investment properties. I'm the one who bought the house, Dad. The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly, though it probably lasted only seconds. You? He finally managed. You bought our house? But why didn't you tell us? I wanted to ensure you received the full market value, I explained. If you'd known it was me, you might have insisted on selling it for less, and I know you need those funds for your retirement. I also wanted you to feel free to move forward with your plans for the retirement community, without feeling obligated to stay because I'd purchased the house. I don't know what to say, Dad murmured, his voice a mixture of confusion and what might have been relief. Does your mother know? Does Megan? No one knows except me, my financial advisor. And now you. I was planning to tell everyone once. You and Mom had finalized your plans for moving. Another silence followed as my father processed this information. When he spoke again, his voice had regained some of its usual steadiness. So the house will stay in the family after all. That's a weight off my shoulders I didn't even realize I was carrying. The emotion in his voice caught me by surprise. We hated the thought of strangers living there, but we didn't see another option with our financial situation. That's exactly why I did it, Dad. I couldn't bear the thought of losing our family home either. What are your plans for the house? He asked, curiosity now evident in his tone. This was the question I had been considering since first conceiving of the purchase. I'm not entirely sure yet. I might use it as a weekend place, or for family gatherings. The important thing is that it remains ours, a place we can all come back to. And Megan? The question carried all the complexity of our family dynamics. I took a deep breath. That's something we should discuss as a family. I'm open to her continuing to live there temporarily, but with clear parameters. This might be an opportunity to establish a different kind of relationship, one that supports her independence rather than enabling dependence. My father was quiet for a moment before saying, "You've always had wisdom beyond your years, Caroline. Even as a child, you seemed to understand things the rest of us were still figuring out." There was a note of something in his voice, pride, perhaps, or recognition, that I hadn't often heard directed toward my practical approach to life. "When should we tell your mother and Megan?" he asked. "Soon," I replied. "But I'd like to think about the best way to frame it, particularly for Megan. This isn't about control or showing that my approach to life is better than hers. It's about preserving something important to all of us while creating healthier patterns going forward." As we concluded the call, I felt a curious mixture of emotions. There was relief that my father knew and seemed to appreciate my intentions. There was apprehension about Megan's eventual reaction. And there was a deeper sense of standing at a crossroads, not just regarding the house itself, but in terms of my role within our family system. For years, I had occupied a particular position, the responsible one, the achiever, the financial backstop when other plans faltered. That role had brought both benefits and burdens. It had given me independence and security, but had sometimes left me feeling more valued for what I could provide than for who I genuinely was. The house purchase represented something different, not just a financial transaction, but a statement about what I valued, what I was willing to invest in beyond immediate returns. It was a commitment to continuity, to preservation of shared history, to the idea that some things shouldn't be surrendered simply because they didn't appear on a balance sheet. As I turned back to my work, I knew that the conversations ahead would be challenging. Patterns established over decades don't transform overnight, and Megan's initial reaction would likely be defensive rather than appreciative. Our parents would navigate their own complex feelings about accepting this reversal of traditional roles, where the child provides security for the parents rather than the other way around. But beneath these challenges lay possibility, the potential, for relationships based on mutual respect rather than established roles, for support that empowered rather than enabled, for preservation of what mattered most while still allowing necessary change. My phone buzzed with yet another message from Megan, this one showing her placing a good vibes only sign on what had been my bookshelf. The irony might have been irritating just hours earlier, but now it struck me differently. Soon enough, she would understand that her redecoration project was taking place in a house that no longer belonged to our parents but to me. What mattered wasn't the momentary satisfaction of revealing that fact, but the opportunity it created to establish something better than the patterns that had brought us to this point. The house was now mine, but its real value lay not in ownership, but in what it could represent for our family's future. A foundation for new beginnings, rather than just a repository of past memories. With that perspective, I turned back to the quarterly forecasts on my desk, knowing that the skills that had served me professionally, patience, strategic thinking, long-term vision, would be equally valuable in navigating the family dynamics that lay ahead. The house purchase wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one that I now had the opportunity to help write. The week following my conversation with Dad unfolded with a particular kind of intensity, one that demanded careful navigation between immediate work responsibilities and the evolving family situation. My father had agreed to keep my ownership of the house confidential for the moment, allowing me time to develop a thoughtful approach to sharing the information with Mom and Megan. Let's wait until after your mother's birthday dinner this weekend, he'd suggested. No need to complicate the celebration with such significant news. I'd agreed, though part of me wondered if we were simply postponing an inevitable confrontation. Delay had long been our family's default approach to difficult conversations, a tendency that had allowed problematic patterns to become entrenched over time. Still, I recognized the wisdom in choosing the right moment for a disclosure that would significantly reshape our family dynamics. Meanwhile, Megan's messages continued, each one documenting another phase of her takeover of my former bedroom. The antique writing desk that Grandma Helen had specifically left to me, now repurposed as a makeup station, the built-in window seat where I'd spent countless hours reading, covered with decorative pillows bearing inspirational phrases like, "Chase your dreams," and "Visualize success." The wall that had displayed my academic and professional achievements, now adorned with a giant macrame wall hanging that Megan had purchased from an Etsy artisan, using Mom's credit card, I later discovered. Each update required disciplined restraint on my part. The temporary satisfaction of informing Megan that her redecorating spree was occurring in a house I now owned would be dramatically outweighed by the complications of a hasty revelation. Instead, I responded with neutral acknowledgments, looks interesting or quite a change, that neither encouraged nor criticized her actions. This measured approach extended to work as well, where I maintained focused engagement despite the background awareness of the pending family matter. The expansion into telehealth services that I'd presented to the board required detailed implementation, planning, and I spent long hours ensuring that the financial infrastructure would support this strategic shift. Daniel Whitaker, the CEO, stopped by my office late Thursday afternoon as I was reviewing staffing projections for the new telehealth division. "Working late again, Caroline?" he asked, leaning against my doorframe. At 58, Daniel had the relaxed confidence of someone who had navigated corporate leadership long enough to distinguish between genuine priorities and manufactured urgencies. "The telehealth numbers looking good?" "Better than expected," I replied, gesturing toward the spreadsheets on my screen. "The operational efficiencies are significant once we move past the initial investment phase. We should see positive returns by second quarter next year, rather than third as originally projected." He nodded, studying me with the perceptive gaze that had made him an effective leader. "You've seemed preoccupied this week. Everything all right?" The question caught me off guard. I prided myself on maintaining clear boundaries between personal and professional matters, on never allowing family complexities to affect my work, performance. That Daniel had noticed suggested I wasn't managing this separation as effectively as I'd thought. Just some family matters, I said, aiming for a tone that acknowledged his observation without inviting deeper inquiry. Nothing that will impact my work. Family often has a way of affecting us whether we intend it to or not, he remarked with the insight of experience. When I was about your age, I was going through a difficult divorce while simultaneously leading the merger with Eastern Regional. I told myself I was keeping the situations entirely separate. He smiled ruefully. My team would probably tell you I wasn't nearly as successful at that as I believed. The human mind isn't quite as compartmentalized as we like to think. His candor created an opening for a different kind of professional conversation. One that acknowledged the whole person behind the executive role. I've recently purchased my parents' home, I found myself explaining. They don't know it was me who bought it. Well, my father knows now, but my mother and sister don't yet. It's creating some interesting dynamics. Rather than offering immediate advice, Daniel asked thoughtful questions about the situation, demonstrating the same careful attention he brought to strategic business matters. After listening to the abbreviated version of our family circumstances, he shared something that struck me deeply. You know, Caroline, in business, we talk about leverage points, those places in a system where a small shift can create significant change. Families have leverage points too. Sometimes acquiring a house isn't just about property ownership. It's about changing patterns that have existed for decades. His perspective resonated with my own emerging thoughts. That's exactly what I'm hoping for, I acknowledged. But I'm concerned about how to introduce this change without creating unnecessary conflict. In my experience, both in business and family, how information is shared often matters more than the information itself, he offered. People respond to how changes make them feel, whether they perceive themselves as participants in the process or merely recipients of decisions made without their input. This observation carried particular relevance for my situation with Megan. Her history of feeling compared to me, of perceiving herself as somehow less valued for her different approach to life, would inevitably color her response to news of my house purchase. If I didn't address those underlying dynamics, the revelation would likely reinforce existing tensions rather than creating opportunity for something new. I appreciate the perspective, I told him sincerely. It's helpful to consider this as a systems change rather than just a property transaction. Daniel nodded, straightening from his relaxed position against the doorframe. Take it from someone who learned the hard way. Sometimes the strengths that make us successful in business can become limitations in personal relationships if we apply them without adaptation. Your analytical skills and strategic thinking are tremendous assets, but family situations often benefit from approaches that prioritize emotional understanding alongside practical solutions. After he left, I sat with his observations, recognizing their relevance to how I'd approached family dynamics throughout my adult life. I had often applied the same frameworks that served me professionally: efficiency, logical analysis, outcome-based evaluation, without fully considering whether these approaches addressed the emotional dimensions of family relationships. Had this contributed to the patterns that now concerned me? Had my focus on practical solutions sometimes missed the underlying emotional needs that drove behaviors like Megan's persistent dependence or my parents' enabling responses? These reflections accompanied me into the weekend and Mom's 65th birthday dinner at Riverside, an upscale restaurant overlooking the city waterfront. The celebration brought our family together in the kind of public setting that historically minimized overt tensions. My parents had arrived early to secure the corner table with the best view, while Megan made her characteristically late entrance, arriving 20 minutes after the reservation time. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, sliding into her chair without genuine apology. The photo shoot for my design portfolio ran longer than expected. The lighting was absolutely perfect, and we couldn't waste the opportunity. She looked the part of a successful design entrepreneur in a cream blazer over a silk camisole, her dark hair styled in elegant waves, accessorized with the gold statement earrings I'd given her for Christmas. The carefully curated image revealed nothing of the financial precarity beneath it. The maxed-out credit cards, the borrowed funds from our parents, the series of abandoned ventures that had preceded this latest passion. "No problem, dear," Mom assured her, though Dad's slight frown acknowledged the inconsideration. "We're just happy you could make it." "I wouldn't miss celebrating my favorite mother," Megan replied with the easy charm that had always smoothed over her lapses in responsibility. She presented Mom with an elaborately wrapped package. "Open it now. I can't wait to see your face." The gift, a hand-painted silk scarf from a local artisan, was genuinely beautiful and thoughtfully chosen. This was the paradox of Megan. Her authentic generosity existed alongside a remarkable self-centeredness. She could be genuinely attentive to others' preferences and desires while simultaneously expecting those same others to continually accommodate her needs and choices. My own gift, a weekend spa retreat that Mom had mentioned wanting to try, seemed practical by comparison, though her appreciation appeared equally genuine. Dad had coordinated with me to give her a pair of sapphire earrings she'd admired months earlier but had deemed too extravagant to purchase for herself. As dinner progressed through multiple courses, the conversation remained carefully within safe territories. Mom's volunteer work with the Literacy Council, Dad's golf league, Megan's enthusiastic descriptions of her design business prospects, my recent presentation to the hospital board. The practiced dance of family discourse, choreographed to maintain harmony by avoiding subjects that might disrupt the pleasant surface. It wasn't until dessert arrived, a chocolate torte with a single candle for Mom to symbolically blow out, that the subject of the house sale inevitably emerged. "Have you and Dad set a moving date yet?" I asked Mom, sensing an opportunity to begin guiding the conversation toward the necessary disclosure. "The retirement community needs 60 days' notice to prepare the unit," she replied, "so we're thinking early December. The buyers have been very flexible about the timeline." "Speaking of the buyers," Megan interjected with a hint of resentment, "I still can't believe you're selling to complete strangers. That house has been in our family for 30 years. "We didn't have many options, honey," Dad explained with the patient tone he typically employed with Megan. "The financial considerations." I know, she interrupted. "Retirement funds and practicality and all that. It's just sad to think of random people in our home, probably tearing out all the character to make it some generic modern box." The irony of her concern about preserving the home's character while she simultaneously eliminated the personal elements of my old room wasn't lost on me, but I refrained from pointing this out. Instead, I saw an opening to begin the conversation we needed to have. "Actually," I said carefully, "I don't think you need to worry about that particular scenario." 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me with varying degrees of curiosity. Dad's held knowledge and support. Mom's reflected confusion. Megan's narrowed with sudden suspicion. "What do you mean?" Mom asked. "Do you know something about the buyers?" I took a measured breath, recalling Daniel's insight about how information is shared being as important as the information itself. "I do. In fact, I know exactly what their plans are for the house." "How would you know that?" Megan challenged, her tone sharpening. "Unless?" Her expression shifted as realization dawned. "Wait, did you buy our house?" The directness of her question eliminated the possibility of a more gradual disclosure. "Yes," I confirmed, meeting her gaze steadily. "I established an LLC called Evergreen Holdings for investment properties. The purchase offer came from me." Mom's hand went to her heart, her expression a complex mixture of surprise, confusion, and what appeared to be relief. "Caroline, is this true? You bought our house? But why didn't you tell us?" "I wanted to ensure you received fair market value," I explained, echoing what I'd told Dad earlier. "If you'd known it was me buying, you might have insisted on selling below market rate, and I know you need those funds for your retirement. So, all this time, when we've been talking about the sale, Mom began. I knew it was Caroline, Dad confirmed gently. She told me earlier this week. And you didn't tell me? Mom's hurt was evident, though directed at Dad rather than me. We thought it best to wait until after your birthday, he explained. No need to complicate the celebration. Megan had remained unusually silent, her expression unreadable as she processed this revelation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sharp edge. So while I've been fixing up my room, making it functional for my design business, it wasn't even going to be mine anymore? Were you just letting me waste my time and money? The selective framing was classic Megan, recasting her takeover of my space as a practical business decision, positioning herself as the victim of others' actions, rather than acknowledging her own assumptions. I recognized the defensive pattern but chose not to engage with it directly. I haven't made any immediate decisions about the house, I said carefully. My primary goal was keeping it in the family. What happens next is something I wanted to discuss with everyone together. Discuss? Megan repeated incredulously. You mean you'll graciously tell us your plans for what used to be our family home, but is now your personal property? Megan, Dad cautioned, but I raised a hand to indicate I could address her concern. I understand this is surprising news, I acknowledged. And I recognize that it shifts the dynamics in ways that might feel uncomfortable. But my intention wasn't to assert control. It was to preserve something important to all of us. By buying it secretly? Her skepticism was evident. By ensuring Mom and Dad received the full value they needed for their retirement, I corrected gently. And by preventing the house from going to strangers who might indeed have turned it into the generic modern box you mentioned. Mom reached across the table to take my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't know what to say, Caroline. This is extraordinary. To think you would do this. It makes financial sense, too, I added, knowing that practical considerations would help normalize what might otherwise feel like an excessively grand gesture. Real estate in that neighborhood is a solid investment, and the house has good bones despite needing some updates. This framing seemed to ease some of the emotional intensity, providing familiar territory of practical considerations rather than dwelling exclusively on the deeper implications of my actions. Dad nodded approvingly, recognizing my attempt to rebalance the conversation. So what are your plans? Mom asked. Will you move back in? I'm not planning to leave my apartment downtown immediately, I explained. It's convenient for work, and I've just renewed the lease. But I've been thinking the house could serve multiple purposes. A place for family gatherings, perhaps a weekend retreat for me, and potentially— I paused, looking directly at Megan. A temporary residence for you while you establish your design business, if that would be helpful. The offer clearly caught her by surprise. She had prepared for confrontation, for another instance of feeling overshadowed by her successful older sister. My suggestion of accommodation rather than exclusion disrupted her anticipated narrative. You'd let me stay? The question contained both suspicion and hope. With some parameters, I clarified, not as an indefinite arrangement, but as a runway to help you build something sustainable. The deliberate echo of our parents' frequent terminology, providing Megan with a runway for her various ventures, wasn't lost on any of us. But the context had shifted significantly. This wouldn't be another instance of enabling dependency, but an opportunity structured to support genuine independence. What kind of parameters? The wariness in her tone suggested she anticipated unreasonable restrictions. We can discuss specifics later, I said, conscious of the restaurant setting and Mom's birthday celebration. The important thing is that this could be an arrangement that benefits everyone. You'd have stability while building your business. Mom and Dad would know the house remains in the family, and I'd have the investment secured with someone I trust living there. The framing was deliberate, presenting the arrangement as mutually beneficial rather than as charity or control. Positioning Megan as someone I trusted rather than someone who needed supervision. Creating space for her to accept support without surrendering dignity. "I'd want to make some changes," she said, testing boundaries already. "If I'm going to use it as a base for my design business, I'd need to update some things." "We can discuss reasonable modifications," I agreed. "Some updates would actually increase the property value, which would benefit both of us." The conversation continued, gradually transitioning from the initial shock of revelation to more practical considerations about timelines, the retirement community move, and potential arrangements for the house. Though tensions hadn't completely dissipated, Megan's contributions still carried undertones of defensiveness, and Mom occasionally seemed overwhelmed by the implications of this change. We were beginning to navigate this new territory together. As dessert concluded and the server brought the check, which I quietly took care of, Dad raised his water glass in a simple toast. "To family," he said simply, "and to new beginnings." We all raised our glasses, though I noticed Megan's participation carried a hint of reservation. The evening had disrupted her expectations, requiring adjustment to a narrative different from what she had anticipated. That adaptation wouldn't happen instantly, regardless of how carefully I had tried to frame the situation. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Mom pulled me aside while Dad and Megan walked ahead toward the valet stand. "I don't know quite how to process what you've done," she admitted, her eyes searching mine. "Part of me feels overwhelming gratitude, and part feels, I don't know, embarrassed that you felt you needed to do this." "There's no reason for embarrassment," I assured her. "The house matters to me too. This wasn't just about helping you and Dad. It was about preserving something that's important to all of us." "You've always been our rock," she said softly. "Even when you were young, you were the one we never had to worry about. Sometimes I wonder if we leaned on that too much, if we expected too much responsibility from you while giving Megan too little." The acknowledgement, so simple yet so profound, caught me by surprise. Throughout our family history, the differences between Megan and me had been framed primarily as personality traits or natural inclinations, rather than as patterns that our parents' responses had helped reinforce. "We've all played our parts," I said carefully. "But maybe this is an opportunity to try some different roles." Mom nodded, squeezing my hand. "You're right, and perhaps it's not too late to make some changes." As we joined Dad and Megan outside, I felt a cautious optimism about the path ahead. The house purchase had indeed functioned as what Daniel had called a leverage point, a place where a targeted intervention could potentially shift entrenched patterns. The initial disclosure had gone neither as smoothly as I might have hoped, nor as catastrophically as I had feared. The real work, of course, lay ahead. Transforming established family dynamics wouldn't happen through a single conversation or gesture, no matter how significant. It would require sustained commitment from all of us, willingness to recognize habitual patterns, courage to attempt different responses, patience through the inevitable setbacks that would occur as we navigated unfamiliar territory. Driving home to my apartment after dropping my parents at their house, I reflected on how this situation exemplified a principle I'd observed repeatedly in my professional life: that meaningful change rarely comes through grand gestures alone, but through consistent alignment of daily choices with deeper values and intentions. The house purchase had created possibility, but the realization of that possibility would depend on the smaller decisions that followed. My phone chimed with a text message from Megan. "We should talk about the house situation. Coffee tomorrow?" Her initiative represented a small but significant shift from typical patterns where I was usually the one to follow up, to initiate resolution, to extend the olive branch after tensions. Perhaps the changed circumstances were already creating space for different behaviors. "Works for me," I replied. "Coastal brew at 10? See you there," came her response without the customary emojis or exclamation points that typically punctuated her messages. As I parked in my assigned space at the luxury apartment building that had been my home for the past 3 years, I recognized that I stood at a crossroads, not just regarding the house itself, but in terms of my relationship with my family and, particularly, with Megan. The patterns established over decades wouldn't transform overnight, but the new circumstances had created an opening for something different to emerge. The question now was whether we would collectively seize that opportunity or revert to familiar dynamics when the initial novelty faded. The answer would depend not just on my approach, but on everyone's willingness to envision and enact different possibilities than those that had defined our relationships previously. Tomorrow's conversation with Megan would be the first test of whether the revelation had indeed created space for something new or had merely shifted the external circumstances while leaving the underlying patterns intact. As I prepared for that discussion, I recognized that the skills that had served me professionally, strategic thinking, clear communication, attention to both immediate circumstances and longer-term implications, would be valuable, but only if balanced with the emotional intelligence and relational awareness that Daniel had gently reminded me to prioritize. The house purchase had been a financial transaction, yes, but its true significance lay in the potential it created for transformation that extended far beyond property ownership. Whether that potential would be realized remained to be seen. But I felt a quiet determination to navigate the path ahead with both practical wisdom and emotional insight, balancing the strengths that had defined my approach to life with an openness to dimensions I had sometimes overlooked. Coastal Brew occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in the city's arts district, its exposed brick walls and industrial lighting creating an atmosphere that balanced urban sophistication with welcoming warmth. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit ingrained through years of professional discipline, and secured a corner table that offered both privacy for our conversation and a view of the entrance. The extra time allowed me to center myself before Megan's arrival. Last night's revelation at dinner had initiated a process that would require careful navigation, not just regarding the practical arrangements for the house, but the deeper patterns that had defined our relationship for decades. Today's conversation would set the tone for that navigation, potentially opening a path toward something healthier than our historical dynamics. When Megan entered at precisely 10, her punctuality itself a departure from established patterns, I noticed subtle signs of deliberate preparation. Her casual outfit of dark jeans and an oversized sweater appeared carefully selected rather than hastily assembled. Her makeup was minimal, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, rather than the elaborate styling she typically favored for professional or social engagements. The effect conveyed seriousness rather than her usual curated image of creative spontaneity. She spotted me immediately, raising a hand in acknowledgement before approaching the counter to order. Another departure from pattern. Typically, she would have expected me to have her drink waiting or would have asked me to order while she settled at the table. These small shifts suggested she was approaching this conversation differently than our usual interactions. "I ordered a pour-over," she said as she joined me several minutes later, setting down a ceramic mug adorned with the cafe's minimalist logo. "Thought I might need the extra caffeine today." The subtle humor acknowledged the significance of our conversation without creating immediate tension. I appreciated the approach. "Sleep okay?" I asked, recognizing the dark circles beneath. Her eyes that makeup hadn't fully concealed. She shrugged, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Not really. Had a lot on my mind after the bombshell you dropped at dinner." "I can imagine," I acknowledged. It wasn't how I'd planned to share the news. "How had you planned it?" The question contained genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "More gradually, with more context about why I made the decision and what possibilities it might create for all of us." Megan nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her coffee. "When did you decide to buy the house?" "Almost immediately after Dad mentioned they were considering selling," I admitted. "The thought of strangers living there, of losing our family home, completely felt wrong. I had the financial capacity to prevent that from happening. So I did. Without telling anyone, she noted, though her tone remained neutral. I explained part of that reasoning last night, wanting to ensure Mom and Dad received full market value rather than feeling obligated to offer me a discounted family rate. I paused, considering how much additional context to provide. Daniel's advice about information sharing echoed in my thoughts, prompting me to continue. But there was another factor, too. I wanted to avoid the purchase becoming entangled in our complicated family dynamics before it was finalized. Megan's eyebrow arched slightly. Complicated family dynamics? You mean me? Her directness created an opening for honesty that might serve the conversation better than diplomatic evasion. Partly, yes. Our history involves certain patterns that could have made the process more difficult if addressed prematurely. Rather than responding defensively as I might have expected, Megan surprised me by nodding slowly. You mean my tendency to feel overshadowed by your achievements and react by either competing or withdrawing. The self-awareness in her assessment caught me off guard. That's part of it, I acknowledged cautiously. I've been in therapy for the past 6 months, she said, meeting my surprised expression with a small, rueful smile. Turns out when your 5th passion project collapses and you're approaching 30 with nothing to show for it except maxed-out credit cards and a childhood bedroom you've reclaimed from your successful sister, it prompts some uncomfortable self-reflection. This revelation represented a significant departure from the narrative I had constructed about Megan's recent behavior. I had interpreted her takeover of my former bedroom as another expression of entitlement, another instance of prioritizing immediate desires over practical considerations. The possibility that it might have coincided with genuine efforts toward greater self-understanding hadn't occurred to me. I didn't know, I said simply. I didn't tell you, or Mom and Dad. She traced the rim of her mug with one finger. It felt like admitting failure, again, and with our family's track record of addressing difficult topics. We don't, I finished for her, acknowledging our shared understanding of the family's communication patterns. Exactly. She took a sip of her coffee before continuing. My therapist has some interesting theories about our family system, about how Mom and Dad's responses to our different temperaments ended up reinforcing certain roles that became increasingly rigid over time. The parallel to my own reflections following the conversation with Daniel was striking. What kind of roles? You as the responsible achiever who never needed support. Me as the creative free spirit who never fully launched. Her expression turned reflective. Apparently, those complementary roles can become a kind of trap for everyone involved. The achiever gets stuck carrying excessive responsibility while missing out on support. The free spirit never develops genuine independence because the system keeps reverting to familiar patterns of rescue and dependence. Her articulation of these dynamics with such clarity suggested deeper engagement with these insights than I had anticipated. That's remarkably insightful. Megan laughed softly, though the sound carried more rue than humor. Don't sound so surprised. I'm capable of insight when I'm not busy self-sabotaging or comparing myself to my brilliant sister. The comment might once have sounded bitter or accusatory, but today it carried a different quality, a self-awareness that acknowledged the pattern without being completely captured by it. I've been doing some reflection of my own, I offered, recognizing an opportunity for reciprocal vulnerability that might serve our conversation, about how my approach to family dynamics has been shaped by the same patterns, how I've sometimes prioritized practical solutions over emotional understanding. Megan nodded. The family fixer, always solving problems, but maybe missing the underlying emotional needs. There was truth in her assessment, though hearing it articulated so directly created a moment of defensive tension that I consciously chose to move through rather than act from. That's a fair observation. So here we are, she said, gesturing between us. The overachiever and the underachiever, trying to figure out if we can relate to each other differently now that you literally own our childhood home. The framing, direct yet tinged with self-deprecating humor, created space for addressing the situation honestly without becoming mired in historical grievances. I found myself appreciating Megan's approach to this conversation more than I had anticipated. I meant what I said last night, I told her. About you potentially staying in the house while you establish your business. But you're right that the circumstances create an opportunity to develop a different kind of relationship between us and within the family system generally. With parameters, she recalled, referencing my qualification from the previous evening. What exactly did you mean by that? This was the juncture where our conversation could easily revert to established patterns. Me setting conditions from a position of authority, now reinforced by property ownership, Megan responding with either resentful compliance or rebellious rejection. Navigating differently would require conscious choice from both of us. I was thinking we could establish an arrangement that supports your independence rather than fostering dependence, I said carefully. Something structured to help you build a sustainable business rather than just providing temporary accommodation. Like what? Her tone remained neutral, neither immediately defensive nor prematurely grateful. You mentioned using the house as a base for your design business, I noted. What if we approached this as a kind of incubator arrangement? You'd have stable housing while building your client base, and in exchange, you'd contribute to the property in ways that align with your skills and business goals. Her expression reflected cautious interest. What kind of contribution? You have legitimate design talent, Megan. This acknowledgement wasn't mere flattery, but genuine recognition of abilities I had sometimes minimized in our competitive dynamic. The house could benefit from thoughtful updating that preserves its character, while creating more contemporary appeal. What if your rent involved developing and implementing a cohesive design plan for the property? The suggestion visibly surprised her. You'd trust me with that? The question revealed volumes about our historical relationship, about her. Perception that I fundamentally doubted her capabilities despite surface expressions of support, about the ways our established patterns had created and reinforced such doubts. I would, I confirmed, holding her gaze steadily. With appropriate budgeting and planning, of course. But yes, I think your aesthetic sense combined with practical experience could create significant value for the property while simultaneously building your professional portfolio. Megan sat back slightly, processing this proposition. That's not what I expected you to suggest. What did you expect? Strict financial terms, regular rent payments, detailed rules about what I could and couldn't change in the house. Basically, a landlord-tenant relationship with a side of big sister supervision. Her candid assessment of expectations highlighted how our patterns had created predictable anticipations of each other's behavior, anticipations that often shaped interactions more powerfully than what actually occurred in the moment. That approach might have been simpler in some ways, I acknowledged. But I don't think it would serve either of us particularly well. It would likely reinforce exactly the dynamics we're both recognizing as problematic. So instead, you're suggesting a kind of professional collaboration? Where I contribute value through my design skills rather than just writing a monthly check. Essentially, yes, though there would still need to be some financial parameters, utilities, maintenance costs, that sort of thing, but the core arrangement would leverage your professional capabilities rather than treating you primarily as a dependent seeking accommodation. She considered this thoughtfully, turning her coffee mug slowly between her palms. It would need to be a genuine collaboration, though. Not you dictating design choices or micromanaging the process. Agreed, though with reasonable budgetary oversight. It is an investment property, after all. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Always the CFO. Some habits run deep, I admitted, returning her smile. But I'm serious about this being a different kind of arrangement than what we've fallen into historically. One that respects your creative expertise while acknowledging practical considerations. One that supports your independence rather than fostering dependence. What about my room renovations? She asked, referencing her takeover of my former bedroom. I've already made significant changes there. This question represented another potential inflection point in our conversation, an opportunity to either reinforce or disrupt established patterns. The easiest response would be to simply approve what she'd already done, avoiding potential conflict. But that approach would undermine the collaborative framework I was suggesting. That space should be incorporated into the overall design plan we developed together, I proposed instead. Some of what you've done may align perfectly with that cohesive vision. Other elements might need reconsideration. Her expression tightened momentarily, the familiar resistance to having her choices questioned, before relaxing into something more thoughtful. That's reasonable, actually. A piecemeal approach wouldn't create the kind of showcase I need for potential clients anyway. This willingness to consider the suggestion on its merits rather than reflexively opposing it represented another, small but significant departure from established patterns. I felt a cautious optimism about the possibility that we might genuinely be creating space for different dynamics to emerge. So, Megan said after a brief silence, what happens next, practically speaking? Mom and Dad will be moving to the retirement community in early December. I suggest we use the next 2 months to develop a formal agreement about your living arrangement and the design collaboration. In the meantime, you can continue staying there as you have been, with the understanding that we're working toward this new arrangement. And if we can't reach an agreement that works for both of us? The question was legitimate, acknowledging the potential for our attempt at new patterns to encounter obstacles we couldn't overcome. Then we reassess. But I think it's worth making a genuine attempt at this approach before defaulting to more conventional alternatives. Megan nodded slowly. I agree. She hesitated before adding, thank you for not just evicting me, which you would have had every right to do given that you own the house now. That was never my intention, I assured her. Keeping the house in the family means maintaining. It is a place where family can belong, including you. Another silence followed, though it felt companionable rather than tense. A shared moment of reflection on possibilities neither of us had anticipated 24 hours earlier. There's something else I should probably tell you, Megan said finally, her expression turning more serious. About my design business. What is it? I actually have been building a real client base. Small projects mostly, helping people reimagine specific rooms or solving particular design challenges. It's not just an Instagram fantasy like my previous ventures. She pulled out her phone, opening a professional-looking portfolio site I hadn't seen before. I've been approaching it differently this time. More discipline, less flashy promises. Building gradually rather than expecting overnight success. The website displayed thoughtful before and after transformations of various spaces. Living rooms, home offices, small business interiors, with descriptions that emphasized practical considerations alongside aesthetic choices. The work showed genuine talent applied with methodical attention rather than haphazard inspiration. This is impressive, I said, genuinely surprised by both the quality of the work and the professional presentation. How long have you been doing this? About 8 months. After my last venture imploded, I decided to start smaller and focus on building a solid foundation before making grand announcements. That's part of why I started therapy too. I needed to understand why I kept repeating the same patterns with increasingly frustrating results. This revelation challenged my assumptions about her recent behavior in significant ways. What I had interpreted as another phase of entitled dependence, might actually have been the beginning of a more genuine move toward independence, albeit one still unfolding within the complicated context of our family dynamics. "Why didn't you share this with the family?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Megan's expression turned reflective. "Partly because of our history, the eye-rolling when I announce a new passion, the cautious encouragement that barely masks skepticism. I wanted to establish something real before subjecting it to that familiar pattern." She paused before adding, "And partly because I've been trying to break my own pattern of using external validation, especially from family, as fuel for initial enthusiasm that burns out when reality gets difficult." The insight demonstrated a level of self-awareness I hadn't fully credited her with possessing. "That makes sense." "So this design collaboration you're suggesting," she continued, "it actually aligns with where I've been trying to go professionally. A showcase project that demonstrates both my aesthetic vision and my ability to execute within practical constraints." The synchronicity felt significant, a convergence of separate paths that might create something neither of us could have developed independently. "Then this arrangement might benefit us both more than I initially realized." "It might," she agreed, "though we'd still need to navigate the power dynamics carefully. With you as both property owner and older sister, while I'm both tenant and hired designer, it gets complicated." Her awareness of these complexities reflected a maturity I hadn't fully recognized previously. "You're right. We'll need clear agreements about decision-making authority, budget parameters, timeline expectations, treating it as a genuine professional collaboration rather than a family favor." "Speaking of which," she said, her expression turning slightly hesitant, "what are your thoughts on compensation? Beyond the housing arrangement, I mean." The question was entirely legitimate in the context of a professional collaboration, yet it highlighted the complexity of the arrangement we were contemplating, one that blended family dynamics with business considerations in ways that could easily become problematic without careful boundaries. "I think it depends on the scope we define together," I replied thoughtfully. "If we're talking about a comprehensive redesign that significantly increases the property's value and provides you with professional portfolio material, that represents meaningful compensation in itself when combined with reduced housing costs. But if the project expands beyond that initial scope or requires extraordinary time commitment, additional financial compensation would be appropriate." Megan considered this, then nodded. "That seems reasonable. We can define the baseline project that constitutes rent equivalent and establish parameters for additional compensation if we expand beyond that scope." Exactly. Treating it as a business arrangement with clearly defined expectations rather than the kinds of vague understandings that have sometimes created problems in family contexts. A small smile tugged at her lips. "You mean like when I agreed to handle some social media for Mom's Literacy Council and somehow ended up managing their entire online presence for 6 months?" "Precisely," I acknowledged, returning her smile. "Clear boundaries serve everyone better, even if they're initially more difficult to establish." We spent the next hour discussing preliminary ideas for the house project, potential focus areas, stylistic approaches that might honor the home's character while updating its functionality, timeline considerations given Mom and Dad's December move. The conversation flowed with surprising ease, blending Megan's creative vision with my practical considerations in ways that felt complementary rather than adversarial. As our coffee cups emptied and the cafe began filling with the late-morning crowd, I found myself experiencing an unfamiliar emotion in relation to Megan, something approaching partnership rather than the protective concern or contained frustration that had more typically characterized my feelings toward her in recent years. "This has been productive," I said as we prepared to leave. "Much more so than I anticipated, to be honest." "Same here," she admitted. "I came ready for battle and found I don't know, possibility instead? Exactly. Though we should recognize that translating today's productive conversation into sustained new patterns will require consistent effort from both of us. Old habits reassert themselves easily, especially in family systems. My therapist would be so proud of that insight, Megan said with a laugh that contained genuine warmth rather than defensive deflection. She's been trying to help me understand that changing patterns requires ongoing awareness, not just momentary insights. Your therapist sounds wise, I acknowledged, and I appreciate you sharing that you've been working on these issues. It helps me understand your recent choices in a different context. As we walked toward the exit, Megan hesitated, then asked, "Would you be open to coming by the house later this week? I'd like to show you some of the changes I've been considering. For the main living areas, not just my room. Having your perspective before we develop the formal proposal would be helpful." The invitation represented another small but significant shift, reaching for collaboration rather than proceeding independently and seeking approval after the fact. "I'd like that. Thursday evening after work?" "Perfect. I'll order dinner from T. That Thai place you like on Elmwood." This thoughtful consideration of my preferences, another departure from her typical self-focused approach, further reinforced my cautious optimism about the possibility of genuine change in our relationship dynamics. As we parted outside the cafe, Megan surprised me with a brief but genuine hug, the kind of physical affection that had become increasingly rare between us, as adult tensions replaced childhood closeness. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the house, yes, but more for being willing to try something different with me." "Thank you for the same," I replied, recognizing that her openness to this conversation had been equally essential to its productive outcome. Driving back toward my apartment afterward, I reflected on how dramatically my expectations for the morning had been upended. I had approached the conversation prepared for defensiveness, for implicit accusations of overreaching control, for the familiar pattern of Megan positioning herself as victim of circumstances rather than agent of her own choices. Instead, I had encountered a version of my sister demonstrating greater self-awareness and responsibility than I had credited her with possessing. The revelation of her therapy, her more methodical approach to her design business, her willingness to acknowledge problematic patterns, all suggested the possibility of genuine development rather than merely superficial adaptation to changed circumstances. This unexpected development prompted reflection on my own role in our historical dynamics. Had my perception of Megan been so colored by established patterns that I had failed to notice emergent changes? Had my anticipation of her limitations sometimes functioned as a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating conditions where her growth remained invisible to me even when genuinely occurring? These questions weren't merely academic. They carried practical implications for how I would engage with her moving forward, whether I would relate to her based on updated understanding or revert to assumptions built from historical patterns, whether I would create space for her continued development or unconsciously reinforce limitations I had come to expect. The house purchase had indeed functioned as what Daniel had called a leverage point, creating opportunity for significant change in established systems. But the realization of that potential would depend on sustained commitment to different patterns of engagement, not just changed external circumstances. As I arrived home and prepared for afternoon meetings, I felt a quiet optimism about the path ahead, not naive certainty that all historical tensions would miraculously resolve, but genuine hope that meaningful change might be possible if we remained conscious of the patterns we were attempting to transform. The house that had been the setting for the development of our complicated family dynamics might now become the context for their thoughtful revision, a place where new patterns could emerge alongside honored traditions, where the inheritance of physical property could coincide with the more meaningful legacy of healthier relationships and authentic belonging. Thursday evening arrived with unexpected anticipation. As I navigated through downtown traffic toward the family home, my property now, though the psychological adjustment to that reality remained ongoing. I found myself genuinely curious about Megan's design ideas. Our coffee conversation had revealed dimensions of her professional approach I hadn't previously recognized, challenging assumptions I'd held about her creative pursuits. The neighborhood welcomed me with familiar landmarks: the massive oak at the corner of Maple and Pine, its branches now adorned with autumn colors, the craftsman bungalow with the meticulously maintained garden, the small park where we had played as children. These constants provided comforting counterpoint to the significant changes unfolding in our family dynamics. Megan's car sat in the driveway, a practical sedan that had replaced her previous impractical convertible, another sign of shifting priorities I had failed to fully register. Lights glowed warmly through the front windows, creating an inviting tableau against the deepening twilight. I used my key to enter, calling out as I stepped into the foyer, "Megan, I'm here." "In the dining room," she replied. "Come see what I've been working on." Following her voice, I found the dining room transformed into an impromptu design studio. Our mother's antique table, typically reserved for holiday gatherings and special occasions, now supported an array of material samples, color swatches, and detailed sketches. A laptop displayed 3D renderings of what appeared to be the living room with various configuration options. Presentation boards leaned against the walls, showing before and after concepts for different areas of the house. Megan stood beside this display, her expression a mixture of professional pride and personal vulnerability. She wore dark jeans and a simple blouse rather than the carefully curated, creative professional image she typically projected, and her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that suggested focus on work rather than appearance. "This is extensive," I observed, taking in the comprehensive nature of her preparation. "When did you put all this together?" "I've been developing concepts for a while," she admitted. Initially, just as creative exercises, then more seriously as I considered how the space could function better. After our coffee conversation, I refined everything into a cohesive presentation. The level of thought and effort evident in the materials before me surpassed my expectations substantially. These weren't hasty sketches or vague concepts, but thoroughly considered proposals that addressed both aesthetic and functional dimensions of the space. "May I?" I gestured toward the presentation boards. "Please, I'd appreciate your honest perspective, not just polite approval." This straightforward request for authentic feedback rather than mere validation represented another subtle shift from our historical patterns, where Megan typically sought praise while simultaneously preparing to reject criticism as evidence of my supposed hypercritical nature. I examined each board carefully, noting how the proposals respected the home's architectural character while addressing practical limitations that had frustrated our parents for years. The awkward kitchen layout that made holiday meal preparation needlessly challenging, the poorly configured master bathroom that wasted valuable space, the underutilized sunroom that could become a multi-purpose area with thoughtful redesign. "These are genuinely impressive," I said, the assessment honest rather than merely supportive. "You've identified the key functional issues while preserving the elements that give the house its character." "The balance is crucial," Megan agreed, professional confidence evident in her tone. "Too many renovations strip away the distinctive features that make older homes special, but refusing to address legitimate functional constraints doesn't serve modern living needs either." "I particularly like this concept for the kitchen," I noted, indicating a design that maintained the vintage feel while significantly improving workflow and storage. "The banquette seating creates both additional storage and a casual dining area without sacrificing the formal dining room that Mom loves for entertaining." "That was the trickiest area to balance competing needs," she acknowledged. "Dad wants modern efficiency, Mom cherishes traditional elements, and the space itself has structural limitations that constrain the options." As we continued discussing specific aspects of her proposals, I noticed how she handled my questions and occasional suggestions with thoughtful consideration rather than defensive resistance. When I questioned whether the proposed bathroom reconfiguration might create plumbing challenges, she pulled out detailed notes from a consultation with a contractor rather than dismissing the concern. When I wondered if the color palette for the living area might limit future flexibility, she explained the strategic thinking behind her choices while acknowledging the legitimacy of the question. This exchange of ideas, respectful, substantive, collaborative, felt remarkably different from our typical interactions about her projects, which had historically followed a predictable pattern. Megan's enthusiastic presentation of partially developed ideas, my identification of practical considerations she had overlooked, her defensive rejection of these observations as unnecessarily negative, my frustrated withdrawal from the conversation. The current discussion, by contrast, demonstrated mutual engagement with both creative vision and practical implementation. The scope is ambitious, I noted as we completed our review of the materials. Have you developed preliminary budget estimates for these changes? Rather than bristling at this financial question as she might have previously, Megan nodded and opened a spreadsheet on her laptop. I've broken it down into phases, with essential functional improvements prioritized, before purely aesthetic updates. She displayed a detailed budget that included contractor estimates, material costs, contingency allocations, and timeline projections. The phased approach allows for distributing costs over time while ensuring each completed segment stands on its own functionally and aesthetically. The thoroughness of this financial planning, never Megan's strong suit in previous ventures, further challenged my established perception of her approach to projects. This wasn't the impulsive enthusiasm followed by abandonment when difficulties emerged that had characterized her earlier endeavors, but methodical development supported by appropriate research and planning. This level of preparation is impressive, I said, the observation genuine rather than condescending. You've clearly been approaching this with serious professional intent. I've been trying to apply what I've learned from previous false starts, she acknowledged. My therapist helped me recognize that my pattern of enthusiastic beginnings followed by abandoned projects wasn't just about external obstacles, but about internal patterns too. Fear of failure disguised as creative restlessness, perfectionism, manifesting as perpetual new beginnings rather than completing what might be imperfect. This self-awareness, articulated without defensiveness or self-pity, represented significant development beyond the Megan I thought I knew. The recognition of her own patterns, the connection between internal dynamics and external behaviors, suggested genuine growth rather than merely strategic adaptation to changed circumstances. The Thai food should be arriving any minute, she said, glancing at her watch. While we're waiting, do you want to see what I've done with the room? The invitation to view what had previously been my bedroom, the space whose transformation had triggered such complex reactions when shared through provocative text messages, felt like a potential inflection point in our evolving conversation. Would this tour reveal the thoughtful professional approach evident in her broader design concepts, or would it reactivate the competitive sibling dynamics that had characterized her initial messages about the space? I'd like that, I replied, consciously choosing openness rather than the cautious reservation that might have felt more natural given our history. As we climbed the familiar stairs to the second floor, I found myself viewing the house with dual perspective, both as the childhood home filled with decades of memories and as the property I now owned, with its investment potential and maintenance requirements. This overlapping awareness created a curious blend of emotional connection and practical assessment that seemed appropriate to the complex transition underway. The door to what had been my bedroom stood open, inviting entry rather than marking territory. Crossing that threshold, I found a space simultaneously familiar and transformed. The fundamental architecture remained unchanged. The dormer window where I had spent countless hours reading, the proportions of the room itself, the angled ceiling that had presented decorating challenges and opportunities. But within that, familiar structure, significant transformation had occurred. The changes were more cohesive and thoughtful than the provocative snapshots had suggested. The vision board that had replaced my achievement wall wasn't merely a collection of aspirational images, but a carefully organized visual framework for a developing business, with color palettes, material samples, and project timelines arranged in structured relation to one another. The vanity that had supplanted my bookshelves served dual purpose as both personal grooming station and professional photography setup for documenting design samples and project elements. Most significantly, the overall space functioned as a working studio rather than merely residential quarters, with dedicated areas for client consultations, material selection, digital design, and administrative functions. The practical organization reflected serious professional intent rather than merely self-indulgent transformation of my former territory. "This is different than I expected," I admitted, taking in the functional layout and thoughtful organization. "Different than I portrayed in those texts," Megan acknowledged ruefully. "I was being deliberately provocative with those messages, framing everything as about erasing your presence, rather than creating functional workspace. That wasn't my finest moment." The straightforward acknowledgement of her provocative intent, offered without defensive justification, created space for genuine dialogue rather than rehashing historical grievances. "Why did you send them that way?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Megan leaned against the window seat, considering the question thoughtfully. Part of it was the old pattern, seeking reaction, positioning myself in opposition to you, creating drama that masked deeper insecurities. But part of it was also genuine resentment about always feeling like a guest in the family home, like my presence was temporary, while yours remained somehow more legitimate even after you'd moved out. The insight reflected both emotional honesty and self-awareness that our historical interactions had rarely achieved. "That makes sense," I acknowledged. "I probably contributed to that dynamic in ways I didn't fully recognize." Before Megan could respond, the doorbell announced the arrival of dinner. As we headed downstairs to retrieve the food, I noticed subtle changes throughout the house that hadn't registered during my initial arrival. Thoughtful adjustments that improved functionality without disrupting the home's essential character. Improved lighting in the hallway. A cleverly disguised charging station for electronics that eliminated the tangle of cords that had perpetually cluttered the entry table. Canvas bins in the coat closet that organized seasonal items while maintaining easy accessibility. These modifications weren't dramatic renovations, but strategic interventions that addressed practical frustrations while respecting the home's existing framework. Exactly the approach Megan had articulated in her design philosophy during our review of her concepts. The alignment between stated principle and actual implementation further challenged my preconceptions about her approach to projects. We settled at the kitchen table with our Thai food, a deliberate choice of casual dining location rather than the more formal dining room where her design materials remained displayed. The shift in setting created natural transition from professional review to more personal conversation, a boundary between collaboration and connection that served both dimensions. "I've been thinking about our coffee conversation," Megan said as she distributed spring rolls and opened containers of curry and pad thai. "About the arrangement you proposed where my design work would essentially function as rent equivalent." "What are your thoughts?" I asked, accepting the plate she offered. "I think the concept makes sense, but I'd like to propose a refinement." She hesitated briefly before continuing. "Rather than treating it simply as rent substitute, what if we structured it as a legitimate business partnership specific to this property? You provide the capital investment and property ownership. I provide the design expertise and project management. We establish clear parameters for decision authority, budget constraints, and timeline expectations. And we share in any increased property value that results from the improvements, according to a predetermined formula." The proposal demonstrated sophisticated understanding of business structures that I hadn't associated with Megan previously. You're suggesting a limited partnership specific to the property renovation? Essentially, yes. It creates clearer boundaries than a vague arrangement where my work somehow counts as rent. It establishes appropriate business relationship, alongside the personal dimension, with defined expectations and potential benefits for both parties. The approach resolved several concerns I had recognized, but not fully articulated about the arrangement we had tentatively discussed during our coffee meeting. The potential for unclear expectations, the risk of personal tensions confusing business decisions, the absence of defined metrics for evaluating the collaboration's success. That makes sense, I acknowledged. It would require careful structuring of the agreement to ensure both parties' interests are appropriately protected. Of course, I'd expect nothing less from you, Megan replied with a small smile that held genuine warmth rather than the edge that might have accompanied such a comment in our previous interactions. I've been consulting with a business attorney who specializes in creative entrepreneurship. She's helped me understand different options for structuring this kind of arrangement. This proactive consultation with appropriate professional resources, undertaken before rather than after problems emerged, represented another departure from Megan's historical approach to projects, which had typically involved enthusiastic launches followed by belated recognition of complexities that might have been anticipated with proper planning. I'd be open to exploring that structure, I said, impressed by the thoughtfulness of her approach. It potentially creates clearer parameters than what I initially suggested. That was my thinking. It also establishes the arrangement on more equal footing, despite the obvious differences in our financial positions and the fact that you own the property. A formal business partnership, even one with asymmetrical contributions, creates different dynamics than a landlord-tenant relationship with vague work exchange components. Her awareness of how structural relationships shape interpersonal dynamics demonstrated sophistication I hadn't fully credited her with possessing. You've given this serious thought. I'm trying to apply what I've learned from previous situations, both professional and personal, creating clear frameworks at the beginning rather than attempting to establish boundaries after patterns have already developed. As our conversation continued through dinner, we explored practical aspects of the potential partnership structure, how decision authority would be allocated, what dispute resolution mechanisms might be appropriate, how increased property value would be calculated and shared. The discussion remained focused and productive, balancing creative possibilities with practical considerations in ways that honored both our different strengths and our shared interest in creating sustainable arrangement. There's something else I've been considering, Megan said as we finished our meal. About the broader family dynamics this situation inevitably involves. What specifically? Mom and Dad. Their response to this arrangement will significantly impact how it functions, regardless of how carefully we structure the formal agreement between us. The observation demonstrated awareness of systemic factors that extended beyond our direct relationship, recognition that family patterns involve multiple participants whose reactions and behaviors influence outcomes regardless of individual intentions. You're right, I acknowledged. Their established patterns of relating to each of us will affect how this unfolds, even if they're no longer living in the house. Exactly. If they continue treating me as the perpetual younger daughter who needs supervision while you remain the responsible authority figure, it undermines the partnership framework we're trying to establish. If they view your ownership as justification for weighing in on household decisions they would never presume to influence in your apartment, it creates complicated boundary issues. These potential complications hadn't fully registered in my initial thinking about the arrangement, despite my general awareness of family system dynamics. Megan's articulation of these specific concerns demonstrated thoughtful consideration beyond what I had anticipated. What are you suggesting? I asked, genuinely interested in her perspective rather than automatically assuming decision authority. I think we need a specific conversation with them before they move to the retirement community. One that addresses these dynamics directly rather than hoping they'll somehow adjust without explicit discussion. She hesitated before adding, "And I think we need to present a unified approach rather than allowing historical patterns to reassert themselves through their interactions with each of us individually." The suggestion contained multiple layers of insight. Recognition of how established patterns persist without conscious intervention. Awareness that parental dynamics influence adult-sibling relationships regardless of physical proximity. Understanding. That unified approach would be necessary to establish new patterns rather than merely reinforcing historical roles. That's an excellent point, I agreed, and potentially challenging, given our family's historical approach to addressing, or rather not addressing, these underlying dynamics. Definitely challenging, Megan acknowledged with a small smile. But maybe that's exactly why it's important. This whole situation, you purchasing the house, me establishing my business, our parents transitioning to the retirement community, represents significant change in our family system. If we don't consciously shape how these changes affect our relationships, the system will simply adapt in ways that preserve familiar patterns despite the changed circumstances. This sophisticated understanding of how family systems maintain homeostasis, often reverting to established patterns despite surface changes in circumstances, reflected insights I associated more with my own analytical approach than with Megan's typically more intuitive perspective. The convergence suggested potential for genuine collaboration, drawing on complementary strengths, rather than the competitive dynamics that had historically characterized our relationship. "When would you suggest having this conversation?" I asked, implicitly accepting the validity of her proposal, rather than questioning its necessity. "Before they finalize the move details, but after we've established the framework for our arrangement. So they understand the parameters we've created, rather than attempting to shape them according to their own expectations." The timeline reflected strategic thinking about sequence and timing that demonstrated forward planning beyond immediate concerns, another departure from Megan's historical approach to situations, which had typically involved reactive responses to emerging circumstances rather than proactive consideration of optimal sequencing. "That makes sense," I agreed. "We should have our formal agreement structured before engaging them in that conversation, so we're presenting established framework rather than inviting input on developing arrangements." Exactly. And I think the conversation should happen at neutral location rather than in the house itself, which carries such loaded emotional associations for everyone involved. Good thinking. Perhaps during a lunch at that restaurant near the lakefront they both enjoy. Comfortable setting, but public enough to discourage potential emotional escalations that might occur in more private environment. As we developed this approach, I found myself appreciating the genuine collaboration emerging between us, the building upon each other's ideas, the recognition of complementary insights, the absence of competitive positioning that had so often characterized our interactions. This shift felt significant not merely as temporary cooperation, but as potential foundation for sustained different relationship than what our history might have predicted. After dinner, we returned to her design presentation materials, discussing specific aspects of the proposed renovations with both creative enthusiasm and practical assessment. The conversation flowed naturally between aesthetic considerations and implementation logistics, between vision for what the space could become and realistic evaluation of constraints that would shape the transformation process. As the evening concluded and I prepared to leave, Megan surprised me with an unexpected question. "Would you be open to bringing your financial expertise to this project in a more active way than just approving budgets? There's potential here for structuring the renovation investment to maximize tax advantages and potentially leverage the improvements for additional investment opportunities beyond just increased property value." The invitation to contribute my professional strengths to her creative vision, framed as valuable collaboration rather than necessary supervision, represented significant shift from our historical dynamic, where my financial perspective had typically functioned as constraining force on her creative impulses rather than complementary dimension of shared endeavor. "I'd welcome that involvement," I replied, genuinely pleased by the suggestion. It could create additional value beyond what either of us might develop independently. "That's what I was thinking. Your financial acumen combined with my design approach might create outcomes neither of us would achieve working separately." This recognition of potential synergy between our different strengths, offered without the comparative undertones that had historically colored such acknowledgments, suggested possibility for relationship built on mutual appreciation rather than competitive positioning or assigned family roles. As I drove back to my apartment that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my expectations had been challenged by these recent interactions with Megan. The person I had encountered, thoughtful, self-aware, professionally focused, differed significantly from the image I had constructed and maintained through years of particular patterns and selective attention. This discrepancy prompted important questions about my own role in our historical dynamics. Had my perception of Megan been so colored by established patterns that I had failed to notice genuine development occurring? Had my anticipation of familiar behaviors sometimes functioned as self-fulfilling prophecy, creating conditions where growth remained invisible to me even when genuinely present? These questions weren't merely philosophical, but carried practical implications for how I would engage moving forward. Whether I would relate to Megan based on updated understanding or revert to assumptions built from historical patterns. Whether I would create space for continued development in our relationship or unconsciously reinforce limitations I had come to expect based on past experiences. The house purchase had indeed created what Daniel had called a leverage point, opportunity, for significant change in established systems. But the realization of that potential would depend on sustained commitment to different patterns of engagement, not just changed external circumstances or momentary insights. As I arrived home and prepared for the following workday, I felt a quiet optimism about the path ahead. Not naive certainty that all historical tensions would magically resolve, but genuine hope that meaningful change might be possible if we remained conscious of the patterns we were attempting to transform. The house that had been the setting for the development of our complicated family dynamics might now become the context for their thoughtful revision, a place where new patterns could emerge alongside honored traditions, where the inheritance of physical property could coincide with the more meaningful legacy of healthier relationships and authentic connection. This possibility felt like the most valuable aspect of my unexpected property acquisition. Not the financial investment or the preservation of family home, significant though those dimensions were, but the opportunity to transform relationships that had been unnecessarily limited by unconscious patterns and unexamined assumptions on all sides. As I reviewed the notes I had made about Megan's design concepts and our discussion of potential partnership structure, I recognized that the most important renovation underway might not involve physical spaces at all, but the frameworks through which we related to one another. Frameworks that, with conscious attention and sustained effort, might finally allow authentic connection beyond the confining roles that had historically defined our relationship. The weeks following our Thursday evening discussion unfolded with unexpected productivity. Megan and I established a consistent working rhythm, meeting twice weekly to develop both the design concepts and the formal partnership agreement that would structure our collaboration. Each meeting balanced creative exploration with practical implementation planning, drawing on our complementary strengths while establishing clearer boundaries than had historically existed between us. The attorney Megan had consulted, Elise Donovan of Donovan & Associates, proved impressively knowledgeable about creative business partnerships, offering structural approaches that addressed our specific circumstances without forcing conventional formats ill-suited to our situation. With her guidance, we developed a limited partnership agreement focused specifically on the property renovation, with clearly defined contributions, decision-making protocols, and value-sharing mechanisms. This framework provides appropriate protection for both your interests, Elise explained during our joint consultation, while creating flexibility for the project to evolve organically as implementation proceeds. The document she crafted recognized the inherent asymmetry in our positions. I as property owner and primary capital provider, Megan as design professional and project manager, while establishing genuine collaboration rather than hierarchical control. Decision authority was allocated by domain rather than universally, with me holding final determination on financial parameters, while Megan maintained creative direction within those established constraints. I particularly appreciate the dispute resolution mechanism, I noted as we reviewed the final draft in Elise's downtown office. The tiered approach with specific timelines prevents potential conflicts from derailing progress. That section evolved from my experiences with creative partnerships, Megan explained. Previous collaborations taught me how easily projects stall when disagreements aren't addressed through established processes. This practical wisdom derived from actual experience, rather than merely theoretical understanding or reactionary emotion, represented another facet of Megan's professional development that I hadn't fully appreciated previously. Her insights reflected genuine learning from past situations, rather than the pattern of repeated false starts without accumulated wisdom that had characterized earlier ventures. With the formal agreement established, we scheduled the conversation. With our parents that Megan had wisely suggested. The timing proved strategic, 2 weeks before their planned move to the retirement community, after our partnership framework was firmly established, but before the practical transition fully occupied their attention. I've reserved a private dining area at Harborview for Sunday brunch, I told Megan during our final planning discussion. Comfortable setting, but structured enough to maintain focus on the conversation rather than drifting into social pleasantries. Good thinking. And we're agreed on the key messages? Her question reflected our collaborative approach to this important family discussion, rather than deferring to my historically dominant role in such situations. Yes, we present our arrangement as established partnership with defined parameters, rather than provisional experiment. We acknowledge potential challenges in shifting established family dynamics while expressing confidence in our capacity to navigate them constructively. And we request specific adjustments to their patterns of interaction with each of us to support our evolving relationship rather than reinforcing historical roles. Exactly, Megan confirmed. Direct but respectful. Focused on future possibilities, rather than past limitations. And presented as unified approach rather than individual requests that could be addressed separately according to their established patterns with each of us. This alignment, both in content and approach, reflected significant development in our relationship capacity. Rather than competitive positioning or hierarchical dynamics, we had established genuinely collaborative engagement that honored both common purpose and distinct perspectives. The process felt remarkably different from our historical interactions, where attempts at cooperation had typically devolved into either dominance compliance patterns or competitive jockeying for position. Sunday arrived with clear skies and unseasonable warmth for late October, creating a welcoming atmosphere as we gathered at the restaurant overlooking the harbor. The private dining area I had reserved offered both comfortable ambiance and appropriate privacy for a conversation that might include emotionally significant dimensions. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided calming views of sailboats drifting across the bay, while tasteful acoustic treatments ensured our discussion wouldn't be overheard by other diners. Our parents arrived precisely on time, Dad's punctuality having long-established family standard despite Mom's natural tendency toward more flexible scheduling. Their expressions reflected pleasant anticipation of family gathering rather than concern about its purpose, suggesting our framing of the invitation as celebratory brunch to discuss exciting developments had created appropriate context without triggering unnecessary anxiety. "This is lovely," Mom commented as the host seated us at the window table. Such a thoughtful setting for family brunch. The initial conversation flowed through comfortable topics, their progress with downsizing, preparations, an update on Dad's golf league championship, Mom's literacy council activities. We deliberately maintained this social rhythm through drink orders and initial food selection, allowing natural connection to establish foundation for the more structured discussion to follow. When our appetizers arrived, a selection of shared plates that symbolically established the collaborative tone we hoped to maintain, I exchanged a subtle glance with Megan, acknowledging that the moment had arrived to transition the conversation. "Mom, Dad," I began, "we invited you to brunch today because Megan and I have been developing some plans regarding the house that we wanted to share with you directly." Their expressions shifted to attentive curiosity, with Dad setting down his water glass to focus more completely on the conversation. "What kind of plans?" he asked. "As you know, Caroline now owns the property," Megan continued, her tone naturally picking up where I had paused, a conversational rhythm we had rarely achieved previously. "And I've been developing my design business with increasing focus over the past several months. We've established a formal business partnership specifically focused on renovating the property," I explained, maintaining the collaborative framing through both language and delivery. Megan will apply her design expertise and project management skills to significantly updating the house while preserving its essential character. I'll provide the capital investment and financial structuring. We've developed a comprehensive agreement that defines our respective contributions, decision-making, authorities, and shared benefits. Our parents exchanged a brief glance that contained complex communication developed through decades of partnership. Surprise mingled with cautious assessment, pleasure at our apparent collaboration tempered by uncertainty about its implications. "That sounds interesting," Mom offered carefully. "I'm just surprised that you two would want to work together so closely, given your different approaches to things." The observation highlighted exactly the established perception we had anticipated addressing, the assumption that our different styles and historical tensions would inevitably undermine collaborative efforts, regardless of current intentions or structural supports. "We've discovered our approaches can be complementary rather than contradictory when properly structured," Megan replied. "Caroline's financial acumen and strategic thinking balance my creative vision and design expertise. The formal partnership creates clear frameworks for decision-making that honor our respective strengths without falling into old patterns. We've worked with an attorney to establish appropriate boundaries and protocols," I added. "This isn't an informal arrangement based on vague goodwill, but a carefully structured collaboration with defined parameters." Dad nodded slowly, his expression reflecting both interest and assessment. "Smart approach. Clear frameworks prevent misunderstandings that emotion might otherwise create." His observation came from decades of legal practice managing complex human situations where relationship dynamics frequently complicated otherwise straightforward arrangements. "We've spent significant time developing both the renovation concepts and the partnership structure," Megan continued. "The preliminary designs respect the home's character while addressing functional limitations that have created frustrations for years. The business agreement protects both our interests while creating genuine collaboration rather than hierarchical control." As we outlined the renovation concepts and partnership framework, their expressions gradually shifted from cautious assessment to genuine interest. Mom asked thoughtful questions about specific design elements, particularly those addressing long-standing functional challenges in the kitchen and master bathroom. Dad explored the partnership structure with professional curiosity, noting its thoughtful approach to potential conflict resolution and value allocation. "This is impressive work," he acknowledged as we concluded the overview. "More comprehensive and carefully structured than I might have expected." The assessment, while positive, contained subtle reference to different expectations based on historical patterns, particularly regarding Megan's previous ventures, which had typically involved enthusiastic beginnings without sustained implementation. We recognize this represents significant change not just for the property, but for our family dynamics, I said, transitioning to the more sensitive dimension of our planned discussion. Which is actually the primary reason we wanted to have this conversation before you moved to the retirement community. Their expressions registered increased attention, suggesting awareness that we were moving toward more complex territory than the practical renovation plans. What do you mean? Mom asked. Our partnership creates opportunity for different relationship between us than what has historically existed, Megan explained. But successfully developing that relationship requires changes not just from us, but from established family patterns that have typically positioned us in particular roles relative to each other. The directness of this framing, addressing systemic patterns rather than individual behaviors, represented significant departure from our family's typical approach to relational dynamics, which had historically emphasized practical solutions over emotional patterns and individual choices over systemic influences. What specific changes are you suggesting? Dad asked, his tone reflecting genuine inquiry rather than defensive resistance. We've identified some patterns that have typically reinforced our historical roles, rather than supporting potential growth beyond them, I explained. Patterns that developed naturally over time but may no longer serve our current relationship or future possibilities. For instance, Megan continued, when there's disagreement between us, the typical family pattern involves seeking parental validation for competing perspectives rather than working through the disagreement directly. This dynamically positions you as mediators or judges rather than allowing us to develop our own conflict resolution capacity. Our parents exchanged another glance, this one containing recognition of the pattern we had identified. That's probably true, Mom acknowledged. It's become such an automatic dynamic that I hadn't really considered its implications. Similarly, I added, family discussions typically follow predictable pathways where my practical or financial perspective is weighted differently than Megan's creative or intuitive insights. This pattern positions certain approaches as inherently more valid than others, rather than recognizing different forms of value that various perspectives contribute. Dad nodded slowly, his expression reflecting thoughtful consideration rather than defensive rejection. I can see how that pattern has functioned, he acknowledged. Not from conscious intent to validate one approach over another, but from habitual responses developed over time. Exactly, Megan agreed. None of these patterns developed from negative intentions, but rather from natural adaptations to different temperaments, interests, and developmental pathways. The question isn't why they existed, but whether they continue serving our collective development now that circumstances have changed significantly. This framing, focusing on future possibilities, rather than historical blame, created space for constructive engagement rather than defensive justification. Our parents' expressions reflected genuine consideration, rather than the reflexive resistance that often emerges when established patterns face direct challenge. What specifically would be helpful moving forward? Mom asked, her question demonstrating willingness to consider adjustments rather than automatically defending established approaches. Several things would support our evolving relationship, I replied. First, treating our partnership as established business collaboration, rather than temporary experiment or family accommodation. This means approaching it with similar respect. You would extend to our independent professional endeavors rather than as extension of sibling dynamics requiring parental oversight. Second, Megan continued seamlessly, when we share updates or challenges related to the renovation, responding to them as information about a developing project rather than opportunities to reinforce our traditional roles or validate particular approaches over others. And third, I added, recognizing that our relationship is evolving beyond the patterns established during our developmental years. This means allowing space for different dynamics to emerge rather than automatically relating to us through historically familiar frameworks. The directness of these requests, specific rather than vague, focused on future possibilities rather than past limitations, created foundation for genuine consideration rather than reflexive reassurance or defensive justification. Our parents. Expressions reflected thoughtful engagement with these suggestions rather than automatic dismissal or superficial agreement. These seem like reasonable adjustments, Dad observed after brief consideration. Though I imagine they'll require conscious attention rather than coming naturally, given how established some of these patterns have become over decades. Absolutely, Megan acknowledged. We recognize we're asking for conscious change to long-established dynamics, and we're not suggesting these shifts will happen perfectly or immediately. What matters is shared intention to support our evolving relationship rather than automatically reinforcing historical patterns, even when that requires deliberate choice different from habitual responses. And we understand this adjustment extends in multiple directions, I added. Our own patterns in relating to you will also require conscious modification to support healthier family dynamics moving forward. This isn't about assigning responsibility or blame, but recognizing opportunity for collective growth through intentional choices rather than automatic patterns. This balanced approach, acknowledging mutual responsibility rather than positioning ourselves as evolved individuals addressing parental limitations, created foundation for collaborative engagement rather than hierarchical instruction or blame. Allocation. Our parents' expressions reflected appreciation for this framing, with subtle relaxation of physical posture suggesting reduced defensive tension. I appreciate the thoughtfulness you've both brought to this, Mom said after brief reflection. Not just the renovation plans, which sound wonderful, but this conversation about how we relate to each other. It would have been easier to just proceed with your project without addressing these underlying dynamics. Easier in the short term, but potentially more challenging long term, Megan noted. Unaddressed patterns tend to reassert themselves, despite changed external circumstances, often creating unnecessary tension when relatively straightforward adjustments might prevent complications. Exactly, Dad agreed, his legal background recognizing the wisdom in proactive addressing of potential complications rather than reactive response to problems after they emerge. Setting appropriate expectations and frameworks at the beginning of any significant venture typically prevents more complex difficulties later, whether in business arrangements or family dynamics. The conversation continued through our main course, exploring specific examples of how these adjusted patterns might function in practical situations. Their upcoming move to the retirement community, holiday gatherings, inevitable disagreements that would emerge during the renovation process. Throughout this discussion, a different quality of engagement gradually emerged. More balanced participation rather than historically typical dominant submission patterns. More thoughtful consideration rather than reflexive positioning. More genuine curiosity about perspectives different from one's own. As dessert arrived, a selection of seasonal specialties we had ordered to share, continuing the collaborative symbolism established with our appetizers, Mom raised a question that reflected deeper engagement with the implications of our evolving relationship. I've been wondering, she said thoughtfully, how much our historical patterns may have limited what was possible between you two. Whether our ways of relating to each of you, developed with good intentions but perhaps constrained by our own limitations, inadvertently reinforced divisions that weren't necessary or inevitable. The observation demonstrated emotional intelligence and self-reflection that extended beyond practical considerations to deeper relational dynamics. Rather than defensiveness about past approaches or superficial reassurance about positive intentions, she had engaged with the systemic implications of established patterns on relationship possibilities. I think that's likely true, I acknowledged carefully. Though not from negative intent, but from natural adaptation to our different temperaments and developmental pathways. Systems develop patterns that tend to persist unless consciously adjusted, regardless of individual intentions within those systems. The important thing isn't assigning responsibility for historical patterns, Megan added, but recognizing opportunity for different possibilities moving forward. The past has shaped, but doesn't determine what emerges next if we bring conscious attention to the patterns we enact together. Dad nodded slowly, his expression reflecting deeper consideration than typically characterized his approach to emotional dynamics. There's wisdom in that perspective, he acknowledged, focusing energy on creating preferred futures rather than analyzing past limitations. Though understanding historical patterns certainly informs what adjustments might prove most effective moving forward. This thoughtful engagement, balanced between practical considerations and emotional awareness, between historical understanding and future possibilities, represented significant departure from our family's typical approach to relational dynamics. Rather than the pragmatic problem-solving or conflict avoidance that had historically characterized discussions of interpersonal patterns, genuine reflection and systemic awareness had emerged during this conversation. As our meal concluded and we prepared to leave the restaurant, Dad raised his water glass in simple toast. To new beginnings, he offered, in both physical spaces and relationship possibilities. We joined the toast, the gesture symbolically marking transition from past patterns toward future potentials, not with naive expectation of immediate transformation, but with genuine commitment to conscious development rather than automatic repetition of established dynamics. Walking our parents to their car afterward, I noticed subtle shifts in physical positioning and conversational flow that reflected the discussion's impact. Rather than the historical pattern where Dad and I walked slightly ahead while Mom and Megan followed, we moved as integrated group with balanced conversational participation. Rather than the typical division between practical logistics and social-emotional dimensions, our discussion flowed naturally between renovation timelines and feelings about the upcoming move, between financial considerations and emotional implications of the transition underway. These subtle shifts, unconscious adjustments in positioning and interaction, suggested the conversation had created not just intellectual understanding, but embodied recognition of different possibilities than historical patterns had typically supported. Not dramatic transformation or complete reinvention, but meaningful adjustment toward more integrated engagement than had characterized our family dynamics previously. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.